and said, what's going on? There's some weird action going on in your bet, weird betting action going on in your fight.
I ain't gonna hold you. I just got my motherfucking money in from that motherfucking UFC lawsuit, though. I got my money from that shit.
The drama surrounding Rampage Jackson's celebration began at a moment when nobody expected it, dropping like a thunderbolt across the MMA world on a cold November night in 2025. He sat in front of his webcam the same way he had for years, with that familiar mix of swagger, humor, and unfiltered honesty. But this time the atmosphere felt different. There was a glow about him, a crackling energy that suggested something monumental had happened. As thousands of fans watched him go live, they weren't treated to old fight stories or training memories. Instead, they were witnessing a moment that had been building for over a decade, a moment tied to a legal war that reshaped the entire UFC landscape. Rampage, now older, wiser, and worn in the way only a fighter's life can carve into a man, revealed that he had finally received his payout from the massive UFC settlement. It wasn't just a check. It was vindication. It was a long overdue acknowledgment written in dollars instead of promises. The weight of the moment hit harder than any punch Rampage threw in his prime. This wasn't simply about his own bank account swelling before Christmas. It was a symbolic victory for over 1,000 fighters who lived through years of brutal training camps, bloody wars inside the octagon, and paychecks that never reflected the billions being generated by the promotion. Rampage had spent years speaking openly about unfair treatment, block sponsorships, and the kind of restrictive contracts that kept fighters locked into a system where the promotion held all the power. Now, after years of litigation, the fighters had proof that their voices mattered. The $375 million settlement wasn't just a payout. It was a public stamp of validation for athletes who had been ignored and underpaid while the UFC grew into a global empire. To understand why Rampage celebration struck such a nerve, you have to go back to 2014, when the original lawsuit was filed. Fighters alleged that during the UFC's golden era of explosive growth, the promotion built a near monopoly that prevented them from negotiating freely or exploring opportunities elsewhere. Years of emails, economic analyses, expert testimony, and courtroom battles revealed a system where the athletes carried the physical burden, while the promotion reaped the lion's share of financial rewards. When the plaintiffs finally prevailed, the resulting settlement became one of the largest in sports history, allocating payouts based on each fighter's activity and earnings during the class period between 2010 and 2017. Legends like Anderson Silva received over $10 million. Others, fighters whose names fans barely remembered, saw checks that would change the course of their lives. The extraordinary 97% participation rate underscored the truth everyone already knew. Fighters had been underpaid, undervalued, and unheard for far too long. As Rampage celebrated the moment, the UFC was deep into a new era dominated by billion-dollar negotiations, shifting media landscapes, and increasing scrutiny over fighter pay. The announcement of a $7.7 billion media rights deal had been positioned as a historic leap forward for the promotion. Fans could now access events on Paramount Plus instead of paying huge fees for pay-per-views. But beneath the surface, analysts and journalists pointed out the disturbing imbalance. Paramount won by securing exclusive content. UFC executives won by doubling previous revenue streams. Fans won with cheaper access. Yet the fighters, the very athletes responsible for bringing the violence and drama to life, were once again left wondering how this actually benefited them. With no fighter union, no collective bargaining, and no structural guarantee that revenue increases would trickle down, many began to question how long this cycle of disparity could continue. The timing could not have been more ironic. Just days before Rampage received his settlement money, the UFC was rocked by one of the most alarming scandals in its history. At UFC Fight Night 263, suspicious betting patterns surrounding Isaac Dolgaren triggered an integrity alert that led to FBI involvement. Within hours of his first-round submission loss, Dolgaren's purse was frozen, sportsbooks refunded millions, and an investigation was launched into whether the fight had been compromised. Stories quickly emerged of multiple fighters across different eras being approached with large sums of money to throw fights. Some had been offered more for a loss than they would make in an entire year of competing. These revelations exposed a dark truth within the sport, a truth tied directly to fighter economics. When athletes risk their lives for paychecks that can barely cover training expenses, the door to corruption cracks open wider than anyone wants to admit. The contrast between Rampage's triumphant moment and the scandal unfolding around the active roster revealed an uncomfortable reality. Legends were finally getting compensated for past injustices, while current fighters stood vulnerable in a system that still left many struggling to survive financially. Even with billion-dollar deals being signed and executives celebrating new partnerships, there was no guarantee that the athletes would see meaningful pay increases. The base amounts remained largely unchanged. Entry-level fighters still earned $10,000 to $12,000 to show, the same numbers that had barely moved in over a decade. With the elimination of traditional pay-per-view bonuses under the new media model, fighters who relied on those payouts faced an uncertain future. Dana White insisted that bonuses would increase, but analysts noted that such bumps would represent a fraction of the revenue generated. In a world where the promotion's annual income could soar past $1 billion, fighters receiving 15% or less of total revenue seemed increasingly indefensible. This collision of celebration and crisis crystallized the fractured state of mixed martial arts. Rampage Jackson symbolized the long fight for recognition. His payout marked an overdue correction for past exploitation. Yet at the same time, the betting scandal and the struggles of current fighters highlighted how much work still needs to be done. While the settlement closed one chapter in the sport's evolution, it also exposed the urgent need for structural changes that protect fighters financially and ethically. Without those reforms, the sport risks deeper corruption, wider inequality, and more heartbreaking stories of fighters being pushed into impossible choices simply to survive.